New Hampshire, September 19th, 1961, approximately 10:30 p.m. A middle-aged couple are driving in a lonely rural area when they notice a striking irregularity in the sky. It looks like a bright star, but it moves in an unusual way. The husband suggests that it is most likely a satellite or a plane, but the more they watch it, the less certain they become. Curious, they eventually decide to stop the car and get out to get a better look at the object using binoculars. The fears in the back of their minds are soon confirmed. In their words, it was not a plane, nor a satellite, nor any other object familiar to the night sky. More concerningly, it soon became clear, whatever it was heading in their direction. The events that were about to unfold received attention from millions around the world when the victim's account was, contrary to their wishes, leaked to the public. The Betty and Barney Hill incident would go down as one of the first and one of the most important claims in history of encounters with not merely a craft allegedly from another world, but the beings said to pilot it. It was fundamental towards drawing attention to and shaping public conceptions about alien abductions. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. This is the Campfire series. Join us as we tell and examine the story of the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill. Barney Hill Jr., aged 39, his wife Eunice Elizabeth Hill, who went by Betty, aged 41, and their dog, a dachshund named Delcy, were traveling along State Route 3, making their way to their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They were on their way home from a brief, spontaneous vacation they had taken to Canada. Concerned by reports of an incoming hurricane, they planned to travel late into the night and reach home by 3 a.m. at the latest. Though a storm was on the way, they said their sky was clear on this night. The area in which they were traveling was a rural, forested, and mountainous area. Though it wasn't completely in the middle of nowhere, the area certainly wasn't populous. No other cars had passed them on the highway at all that night. As night fell, they made a brief stop at a restaurant in Colebrook, which they left at 10:05 p.m. The Hills were just south of Lancaster when, at about 10:30 p.m., Mrs. Hill noticed a bright light appear in the southwest sky near the moon and what she believed to be the planet Jupiter. She wondered if it were a shooting star. However, she had doubts from the beginning, namely because the so-called shooting star was shooting upward. Mr. Hill assumed it was a satellite that had gone off its course. As they continued along their journey, the object seemed to become larger and brighter. Eventually, Betty suggested they stop and try to get a better look at the object. They would stop multiple times to do so, trying to view it through a pair of 7x50 binoculars. As they confirmed that it was not only moving, but observed it change its course erratically, Barney began to think, and in fact insist, that it was a plane or a helicopter. But uncertainty began to grow in the back of his mind as well. When they stopped near Cannon Mountain, the object was now to their right, and they were moving in opposite directions. Then, they observed it turn around and begin moving in their direction. Betty believed it was following them. At another stop, the object passed in front of the moon, and Betty observed what she claimed was a wingless, cigar-shaped craft, flashing a series of red, amber, blue, and green lights along its body. She immediately suspected that the object was a flying saucer. Not only had she, like most Americans at the time, heard of the topic before, but her sister had actually claimed to have seen UFOs a few years earlier on 2 separate occasions. Barney, however, remained determined that it was an aircraft of some sort, becoming frustrated with his wife at the implication of alien spaceships. However, details such as the strange movement of the craft and the total lack of sound puzzled Betty and, privately, Barney as well. Barney began to get the feeling he was being watched. The dog began to whine as if it were afraid. At some point, Barney grabbed a .32 caliber pistol from his trunk. They resumed driving. They observed a light on the top of Cannon Mountain go off as the object flew behind the mountain. The object then reappeared by a rock feature called the Old Man of the Mountain and began flying in the same direction as the car. As they continued traveling, the Hills passed a motel but made the decision to continue driving back into the empty, lonely darkness. Not long after, the object, now only a few hundred feet in the air, moved in front of them. Betty, who could see it better as Barney was driving, said the object now appeared to have a steady white glow and appeared to be spinning and moving in an unusual step-like pattern. She looked through the binoculars and was startled to see what looked like a huge craft of some kind with 2 rows of windows on it. She watched as red lights then appeared on the sides of the object. Betty told Barney to stop the car and look. He stopped in the middle of the road near an area called Indian Head, got out, and looked. The object had, as they described it, swung towards them not more than a short city block away and not more than 2 treetops high, then began hovering silently in the air. Barney equated the shape of the object to a large glowing pancake. The object, which he estimated to be larger than a jet airliner, then swung in what was described as a perfect, silent arc across the road a few hundred feet in front of him. The details of the object, including the row of windows that wrapped around the craft, were now plain to see. The craft stopped over a field to his left. He began walking towards it, while Betty remained in the car. He now noticed that the red lights on the sides of the object belonged to 2 fin-like projections that were extending outwards. The object remained silent. Strangely, though the light of the craft was brilliant, no light fell on the ground. The craft slowly descended in his direction as he walked towards it. Betty started calling out to him, but he did not hear her. He looked through the binoculars again. It was then that Barney claimed he saw somewhere around 10 figures staring at him from out of the object's windows. He said the figures were humanoid in appearance, but that they seemed somehow not human. They appeared to be wearing glossy black uniforms and black caps with bells on them. Then, all at once, all but one of the figures moved away from the windows towards the back wall. They started operating what looked like levers on what appeared to be some kind of control board. The craft moved in closer. The fins extended further out, and some sort of structure, compared to something like a ladder, began to descend from the craft. Barney claimed his memory of this part was blurry, but he recalled the slanted eyes of the figure remaining at the window, whom he assumed to be the leader, staring at him, practically feeling the figure's intense concentration. Terrified, Barney took off running back towards the car, hopped in, and took off as fast as he could, repeatedly yelling to Betty, quote, "They're going to capture us." Barney was practically hysterical. Betty looked out the window as they drove off, trying to watch the object, but she couldn't see it. Although, strangely, she couldn't see any stars in the sky either. Then, they heard a series of irregular beeping noises, which they said sounded like they were bouncing off the trunk of their car. They compared the noises to the sound of someone dropping a tuning fork. The car vibrated with each beep, and they felt an unusual tingling sensation throughout their bodies as it did so. A kind of drowsiness came over them, and their awareness of things began to dull. Moments later, they weren't quite sure how long, they then heard a second series of beeping noises. Their awareness started returning, though such a fog still lay over their minds that they were not exactly processing what was happening. Barney was still driving. They remained silent for a few moments as they tried to figure out where they were. Soon they realized they were near Ashland, about 35 miles from where they had encountered the craft. However, they had very little memory of having driven those 35 miles. Their consciousness fully returned to them sometime after that, once they reached State Route 93, though they were still fairly groggy and disturbed. They didn't speak much for the rest of the ride, apart from agreeing not to discuss what had just happened with others. The craft was nowhere to be seen. The Hills returned home around 5 a.m., a few hours after they had expected. Immediately, the couple noticed and felt a great many abnormal things. Neither of them felt right. They both felt disturbed, strange, and uncomfortable in a very vague way. Both of their watches had stopped, and would never run again. The strap to their binoculars was inexplicably broken. Betty felt a strange compulsion to leave her luggage out of the house and throw the food they had taken on the journey away. Betty changed her clothes and noticed her new dress, which was in good condition before, had been torn in a few different locations and had a stain on it. She put it away and would not retrieve it for 3 years. The tops of Barney's shoes were scuffed, and he had a strange compulsion to examine his groin. The couple sat down and tried to discuss their experiences, but found that they still had difficulty recounting much of it, especially the period between the 2 series of beeps in which they had traveled 35 miles, which was almost completely blank. Betty recalled Barney making a sharp turn somewhere, but she wasn't sure where. Barney recalled a roadblock of some kind somewhere along their journey. They both remembered a, quote, large, luminous moon shape, which seemed to be sitting on end underneath some pines, end quote. However, little more could be recalled. Thus, they went to bed. The incident still haunted them when they awoke that afternoon. Betty was intensely curious about what had happened. Once awake, she would not exactly hold to the commitment of keeping it private for more than a few hours. She called her sister to talk about the incident that day. Barney, however, was not interested in speaking about it. In fact, he had entered into a kind of state of denial about it, in which he would persist for some time. He wasn't sure what had happened, but felt it best to shove it out of his mind and convince himself it was nothing. Naturally, they were frustrated by each other's opposite approach. Upon hearing the story, Betty's sister called a physicist they knew, asking for advice on how to identify any potential evidence. The physicist said that if there were any radiation contamination present on the car from the craft, a compass might react to it. Betty took a compass and went out to the car. Upon examining it, she found over a dozen shiny circular spots on the trunk. The spots were about half dollar-sized and looked like the trunk had been polished in those spots. It occurred to her that this was where the beeping noises had come from the night before. The compass had not reacted unusually anywhere else on the car, but when she placed it there, the needle began to move abnormally. Soon, after discussing the incident with others, it was suggested that they inform a nearby Air Force base which was taking UFO sighting reports at the time. They did so, however. They left out some of the more bizarre details in their Air Force report to avoid appearing like lunatics. Regardless, the individual they spoke to took a great interest in their story and passed the report on to officials involved in Project Blue Book, the Air Force's study of UFOs. After hanging up, they decided to go to separate rooms to draw sketches of what they believed had happened in a way to determine what was true and to avoid influencing each other's memories. The sketches they produced were very similar. 10 days after the incident, Betty had, for 5 or 6 nights in a row, a series of very intense, realistic dreams. She discussed them with some friends from work, one of whom suggested that the dreams could be more than just dreams, but in fact repressed memories, and convinced Betty to write them down. Thankfully, she did, as the dreams would become crucial pieces of the story later on. Barney remained very uncomfortable by the topic and continued to try to ignore it, but Betty became obsessed. She set off to research as much as she could about UFOs and contacted individuals who were involved with the information she found, namely officials involved in the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, or NICAP. NICAP found her story fascinating. They sent it to Walter N. Webb, a lecturer at the Hayden Planetarium in Boston, who served as one of NICAP's science advisors. Webb drove to interview the Hills in person in October. Webb was open, but skeptical. His interview was extremely thorough, and he even made an effort to try to make the Hills slip up to make a flawed or inconsistent claim. However, the Hills' account of things remained, as he said, ironclad throughout a more than 6-hour interview. A month after that, scientist Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson, along with a Major James McDonald of the Air Force, sat down at their home for an extraordinarily thorough interview, which would end up lasting 11 hours. Like Webb, they found the story to be consistent and fascinating, though there were some details that did not make sense. The most major of the inconsistencies identified was the length of time it took them to get home. From where they left the diner in Colebrook at 10:05 p.m. to their home in Portsmouth was, according to Mr. Hill himself, less than a 4-hour drive. Accounting for their stops to look at the object, they should have been home around 2 or 3 a.m. at the latest, but instead got home around 5 a.m. Where were the missing 2 or 3 hours? The Hills didn't have an answer. They had realized that their memory was very hazy for part of their experience, especially during the period in between the 2 series of beeps, and that there was something about it that didn't quite add up. But it was now, as they focused on it in this interview, that they began to realize the seriousness and potential great length of what they had lost. This period of time soon became a focus of the investigation. Major MacDonald suggested that their memories could possibly be retrieved using medical hypnosis. The Hills were open to this idea. Even Barney, who was becoming more open to the conversation after being taken seriously by intelligent officials. However, a psychiatrist whom they later consulted advised them to hold off on hypnosis, as forcing memory retrieval could be harmful. In the meantime, the Hills revisited the areas in which their encounter had taken place numerous times, trying to recall whatever they could. Doing this, however, would unfortunately be of very little help to their memories. The couple would also share the story with more friends and even their church group as time passed. However, the Hills still avoided going public with their story. Still desperate for answers, with Barney especially suffering from what was believed to be post-traumatic stress disorder, in December of 1963, over 2 years after the incident, the Hills finally sat down with the prominent psychiatrist Dr. Benjamin Simon, an expert in hypnosis. Dr. Simon was not interested in UFOs, but he found their case fascinating all the same. His main goal, though, was to relieve the anxiety associated with the incident, so he maintained neutrality on the existence of extraterrestrials. On February 22, 1964, he began to explore their story under hypnosis, with a particular focus on the period which they said they could not remember. They would meet with Dr. Simon every Saturday until June 27th of that year. The Hills would be separately hypnotized each time, recounting their stories with the other out of the room. Dr. Simon directed them not to remember anything they brought up during hypnosis after they were brought out of it, unless he informed them otherwise, which, due to the nature of hypnosis, worked. Simon wanted to keep the memories repressed until it was over to prevent communication between the couple that would disrupt their memories, and assess the full emotional effect of the story before risking bringing it up to surface. These sessions were recorded on 11 hours of tape. What they were about to tell Dr. Simon is what made this case famous. It was while standing in the field at Indian Head, seeing the craft up close, that Barney's conscious memory began to become vague. Under hypnosis, he was able to elaborate more on what he saw. The beings visible through the windows, referred to as men throughout the discussion, wore black uniforms with what seemed like scarves over their shoulders. He said that, as he observed the figures running to the back wall, one of them turned his head around and, looking over his shoulder, smiled at him. However, this was very vague, and he later said that he could not remember their mouths very well and that the eyes only moved in a way that he interpreted as a smile. The figure who remained at the window, whom he assumed to be the leader, also wore what he described as a shiny black jacket. The eyes of the leader had a profound impact on Barney. He felt them looking at him even when the figure was not present. Barney said that he believed this figure was somehow communicating with him, encouraging him to stay there, stay where you are, and keep looking, over and over. Barney had difficulty explaining how exactly this communication was happening. The way he described it suggested it was some form of telepathic communication, where he did not hear a voice, but meaning was somehow conveyed to him. Terrified, Barney ripped the binoculars away from him, tearing a strap in the process, and took off running. This was when Barney ran back to the car and drove off. They then began to reach the part of the story that was nearly completely blank in both of their memories, the period following the first series of beeping noises. Barney and Betty became much more vague and profoundly emotional when retelling this part of the story. Under hypnosis, they were not only remembering, but reliving the experience. As they recounted these events to Dr. Simon, both of them began to cry, yell, and panic. After hearing the beeping noises, Barney braked suddenly, then turned off the highway down a few roads that led into a lonely forested area. Barney recalled he couldn't understand why he had turned off Route 3, and later attributed it to the voice in his head. This was the sharp turn Betty had vaguely consciously recalled. They drove to a point where there was a great orange glow in the road coming from the woods. In the road stood between 6 and 12 figures in dark uniforms. Then the car stalled, and the men in the road began approaching the car. Betty became terrified and had a powerful urge to get out of the car and run. However, because of their dazed, drowsy state, neither of them were able to react. Barney felt weak, but not necessarily afraid at this moment. They would later equate how they felt then to how they felt during hypnosis. They opened their doors, and the beings began escorting them down a path to their ship. Betty and Barney both walked. Barney's eyes were closed for much of this portion of the story, feeling that the leader encouraged him to keep them closed. Barney was carried by the men, his feet dragged as they walked, which he later believed to be the origin of his scuffed shoes. Barney had no recollection of what happened to Betty. Betty, however, was much more lucid throughout this portion of the story. She became angry and turned behind her and called out to Barney, who she said appeared to be dazed, almost sleepwalking. After she did so, one of the beings near her said, "Barney? Is that his name?" She did not respond to them. The being then told her not to be afraid, and said that they were only going to perform some tests, and assured her that they would not be harmed and would be safely returned. Betty said the man who spoke was very businesslike and spoke with an accent, though she could never recognize the accent. Like Barney, the way the beings communicated would later be a subject of confusion for her. They both described the men as short, 5 feet or 152 centimeters at most. Their skin was described as an almost metallic-looking gray. Betty thought the leader may have been taller and of a slightly different skin color, but Barney believed they were all the same. Their bodies seemed disproportionate, with large chests and slender hips. They had odd-shaped heads with a large cranium that diminished in size as it got to the chins. Their eyes were slanted and larger than a human's. Their eyes had pupils. Betty had a vague memory of their eyes reminding her of cat's eyes. The clothing they wore seems to have been recounted in contradictory ways. Neither of them recalled any hair or headgear on the creatures, apart from the black cap, which Barney, now under hypnosis, claimed only the leader wore. Likewise, he said only the leader wore a black, leathery-looking jacket, while the others wore light-colored shirts when seeing them in the ship window, and dark uniforms off the ship. Their mouths, which again were one of the more difficult details to remember, were described as thin and lipless. The two were escorted up a kind of ramp into the craft, though Betty tried to resist, and may have even kicked at them. She later believed this may have been part of the origin of her torn dress. The man who had spoken to her told her to stop wasting time. The interior of the craft was lit up with a kind of blue fluorescent light that cast no shadows. They turned left into what appeared to be a long hallway that encircled the craft, with various rooms along the interior of the hallway. Barney and Betty were taken to separate rooms. Barney recalled being taken into a room and placed on a low metallic table resembling an operating table. He vaguely recalled the look of the room, saying it was pie-shaped, except with the tips of the pies cut off. The walls were a kind of sky blue in color, smooth and spotlessly clean. He said the room was brightly lit and mostly empty, with nothing in it or on the walls, apart from the examining table on which he was laid and a cabinet. Betty agreed with most of this, but said that the room in which she was led was less barren, noticing other pieces of furniture such as a metallic white stool, some equipment in the corner, and what she called gadgets on the walls. She added that everything seemed made of metal or plastic, but with a white tone to it. Barney's recollection of this portion was still vague, though, with his eyes closed for most of it. He said he believed there were about 3 others in the room, but only one was interacting with him at a time. He recalled them examining his body, running their hands along his back, opening his mouth, and scratching his left arm with something like a stick. He also recalled a cup being placed around his groin. Betty's description, again, was much more detailed. She was led into a room and seated on a metallic white stool. There were multiple beings in the room with her, including the one who had spoken to her before, and a figure whom she referred to as the Examiner. Like Barney, the beings, specifically the Examiner, examined her body. They took samples of her skin, earwax, hair, and fingernail. wrapped these samples in what was described as a plastic or cellophane-appearing bag, and then put them in a drawer of some kind. They seemed to speak to each other as they worked. Though their communication with the beings was a subject of confusion, they both agreed that the way the beings communicated with each other was totally unintelligible. Barney described it as opening their mouths slightly and making a kind of mum-mum-mum sound. Next, they informed Betty that they wanted to examine her nervous system. They undressed her, struggling with the zipper, thereby tearing the dress further, then laid her onto the table in the middle of the room. Then they brought over a device, described as something that looked like a cluster of needles, with each needle having a wire coming from it. They placed them on her very gently. She could not remember everywhere it was placed, but said she felt it moving around her whole body, even inside her head. Finally, the examiner approached her with a needle about 5 inches in length, which was attached to a tube. She asked him what he was going to do with it. He said it wouldn't hurt, and that it was a simple pregnancy test. He then inserted it into her navel. She protested dramatically as the needle was quite painful at first, but then the one they believed to be the leader came over and placed his hand over her eyes. The pain then went away. The leader apologized, saying they would not have performed the navel test if they knew it would hurt. After this, she said her physical examination was over. They helped her sit up and get dressed. All of the figures then left the room except for the leader, to whom Betty began talking. She was much more comfortable at this point, feeling fairly sure that she was not going to be harmed. She told the leader that it had been quite the experience, but that it was unbelievable, and requested some sort of proof of this to take back with her. The leader suggested she look around the room for something to take back. On top of one of the cabinets, she found a large book. She opened it and found that it was written with writing with which she was completely unfamiliar. The writing consisted of sharp lines of varying thickness, curved lines, and dots, which appeared to go up and down. She asked if she could take the book with her, and he agreed. She then asked where he was from. The leader retrieved an oblong map with dots all over it. Betty would later try to redraw the map from memory. Some of the dots were like pinpoints. Others were as large as a nickel. One large circle that had many lines coming from it, which went to another circle which was quite close but not quite as big. She asked what the lines meant. He informed her that the heavy lines were trade routes, the lighter lines were places they occasionally went, and the broken lines were expeditions. She asked where his home port was. He replied by asking her where Earth was. She laughed and said she did not know, to which he responded, quote, "If you don't know where you are, then there isn't any point in my telling where I am from," end quote. He then put the map away. Soon thereafter, the examiner and some other figures entered the room holding Barney's dentures. They did not seem to understand why Barney's teeth could come out, but hers would not. She replied that Barney had dentures, which were fake teeth, because he had lost his originals from an injury, and explained that many people wear them as they get older. Then the examiner asked what older meant. She explained that as people age, they begin to break down. The examiner asked what age was. She answered that it was the length of time people lived. He asked how long this was. She said about 100 years at most, but most people die before that. He continued asking a series of questions which, each time, resulted only in a new question. What are years? What do you eat? What are vegetables? What is squash? What is yellow? Finally, she told them that she did not know how to answer all these questions, but that there were other people in her country who could explain these things to them if they would come back, to whom she could introduce them. Then, she noted that if they did come back, she wouldn't know where to meet them. To this, the examiner laughed and replied, "We always find those we want to." Meanwhile, Barney was being released from his portion of the examination. He was reunited with Betty, who said that he still had his eyes closed. The beings informed Betty that they could leave, and escorted them halfway to their car. The Hills believed they were in the craft for around 30 to 40 minutes. They felt a rush of air and a temperature change as they exited the craft. However, before parting ways, the leader took the book from Betty. She said this infuriated her and tried to argue about it. He explained that the others did not want her to have proof or to remember the incident. She told him she would not forget. The The leader conceded that this was possible, but explained that it would be better if they did forget. As they parted ways, the leader suggested to Betty that they watch them leave. Barney entered the car ahead of her and found their dog Delcy under the seat, curled up in a tight ball, trembling with fear. Betty went over to Barney, picked up Delcy, and invited him to come watch them leave with her. Barney had no idea what she was talking about, as by this point he had completely forgotten what had just happened. However, he came to watch the craft leave with her all the same. They said the object became a glowing orange ball, which started getting brighter and brighter. Then it took off. Later, they would realize that the image of the craft leaving was the vague memory they had in their minds of a moon at the time of night in which the moon had set. It flew away, disappearing within seconds, leaving them alone in darkness. At this point, the couple both described feeling great happiness, elation, in fact. Barney started the car and began driving back towards Route 3. Then, the couple heard the second series of beeps, and they reached the point of the story where they had a better conscious memory. As mentioned, Barney had an urge to go home and examine his groin, thinking at the time that it was proof that something had happened to him. He would remember to do so when he got home, but by the time he had forgotten why, and noticed nothing out of the ordinary. About 4 months later, though, an almost geometrically perfect circle of warts would develop around Barney's groin. It became inflamed again a few years later during the interviews with Simon, which was verified by a dermatologist he saw who removed them with electrolysis. By April, Dr. Simon had heard their stories fully, and soon allowed them to begin remembering things from their hypnosis and to even hear their own recordings. The experience was quite profound to them. Though they ran through what he called a gamut of emotions while listening to the tapes, and though the tapes remained difficult for them to listen to for years, the predominant feeling upon hearing them for the first time was one of chains being lifted from their shoulders. Dr. Simon was not sure what to make of their story. He was struck by the fact that the stories seemed to be quite consistent with each other. He did not believe it to be a hoax, nor a product of some kind of mental illness. However, he was not convinced that the incident had really happened as they had claimed either. He focused on the fact that their stories were almost identical to Betty's dreams, with only some differences here and there. His main hypothesis soon became that the portion of the story recovered under hypnosis may have developed in their minds in the days after seeing an unexplained object in the sky. Rather than Betty's dreams being a recollection of an experience, he believed they may have been only dreams that they became convinced were reality. When Betty's dreams were recalled around Barney multiple times, Barney may have picked up on the details, convincing himself of it as well, and even subconsciously inventing his own story. However, as will be explored later in this video, there were quite a few problems with this explanation, which Dr. Simon himself was the first to admit. Confusing a dream for reality was something Betty and Barney both admitted they could not rule out, but they never favored this explanation. Betty was fairly adamant that this was a reality, and that she could tell that her dreams were, as she put it, somehow different from the reality. Barney vacillated more between different explanations, but leaned towards feeling that this was something that had truly happened. Furthermore, he had said that he had made a lot of effort to try to prevent Betty from influencing him. By early June, the doctor was beginning to feel that they were reaching an end to their treatment. There was still no clear explanation as to what had happened, but Simon's goal as a doctor was to alleviate the anxiety associated with the event, which he had now accomplished. Furthermore, Simon's ultimate conclusion was that he and hypnosis could not solve the case alone. Thus, the hypnosis sessions ended. The Hills began to ease back into a more normal life, but it would never return to how it had been before. They would never forget the experience, nor would they try. For the rest of their lives, they would pursue their case and the study of UFOs in general. They asked Dr. Simon to preserve the recordings of their sessions and provide them with copies. However, they were not prepared to publicize them. Indeed, they continued actively avoiding publicity. Clearly, given that we are here, they were not successful. They had forgotten that in 1963, they had told their church group about their experience. Unbeknownst to them, their talk with their church group was recorded. In 1965, a reporter working for the newspaper The Boston Traveler, named John H. Luttrell, had somehow been given access to these recordings. He reached out to the Hills and even Dr. Simon for information. None of them were willing to discuss anything, and the Hills even requested that their story remain private. However, Luttrell was able to obtain information, intended to be confidential, from UFO investigators to whom the Hills had spoken. On October 25th of that year, the Boston Traveler began publishing articles about their experience. To the Hills' frustration, these articles became very popular, receiving attention from around the world. More frustrating, though, was that their story was being reported in a sensationalist and erroneous way. Emerging into the public eye, whether they liked it or not, they decided to publicly tell their story themselves and try to correct the inaccuracies. Betty and Barney gave public talks on their incident, and even appeared on radio and television shows. Eventually, they felt their full story should be recorded, perhaps in the form of a book. In 1966, they and Dr. Simon sat down with John G. Fuller to be interviewed for the book that would become The Interrupted Journey. The Hills were not the first people in the world to claim to have been abducted by aliens, nor even the first Americans. However, their case was the first abduction case to receive widespread attention, and indeed was the one which made the concept of alien abductions famous. Similarly, their case was not the first to describe extraterrestrials as they did, but it was the one which brought fame to the group referred to as the Greys, also known as the Zeta Reticulans, named after the star which some people have suggested as their home on Betty's map. More on that later. Barney Hill died from a stroke in 1969, aged 46. Betty outlived him for decades, never remarrying. She unwaveringly stuck to their story and pursued it for the rest of her life. She became active in, and a celebrity in, the UFO community. In 1995, she published her own book, A Common Sense Approach to UFOs. Betty Hill died of lung cancer in 2004 at the age of 85. Her niece, Kathleen Martin, published another book on the subject in 2007, Captured: The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. So, what happened? Being one of the most important UFO cases in history, practically every detail of this complex case has been extensively discussed, analyzed, and contested at some point over the course of 6 decades. Naturally, I will try to provide a good summary of these things, but, of course, there are links to further reading in the description if you are interested. Typically, potential explanations for these types of incidents fall into 4 broad categories, which are not mutually exclusive: hoaxes, misidentifications of normal phenomena, delusions, and reality. A good place to start in determining the likelihood of each is to look at the backgrounds and reputations of the witnesses involved. Who were the Hills before this happened? Barney Hill was a veteran of the Second World War who worked as an assistant dispatcher for the Boston Post Office. He seems to have been a sincere and straightforward person, not given to running off with fantasies. However, he was an anxious person, described by his wife as a bit of a worrier. He was also noted by Fuller to have scored remarkably high on an intelligence assessment. Betty Hill worked as a child welfare worker for the state. She was also considered to be intelligent and pragmatic, and seems to have been much more carefree and a bit more outgoing than Barney. As we have seen, throughout the interviews, she was much more descriptive. Walter Webb described her as, quote-unquote, dominating and possessive, which he contrasted with Barney's, quote-unquote, passive and highly suggestible personality. Both of them were social activists who held prominent positions in numerous community and civil rights organizations. Betty was also the United Nations envoy for the Unitarian Universalist Church, of which the couple were both actively a part. They were each divorced from prior marriages and had met each other in 1956, marrying 4 years later. They had an interracial marriage in a period in which such marriages were not generally considered acceptable, Barney being black, Betty being white. Dr. Simon believed this may have been relevant, and stated that ostracization may have triggered an episode. However, the Hills denied this, saying that their marriage did not cause them many problems. The couple never had children together, though Barney had 2 sons from a prior marriage. Betty was unable to have children. Their work lives were moderately stressful at the time, but neither was suffering from any kind of intense, abnormal stress that one would expect to be associated with some kind of delusional experience. Neither of them had much interest in UFOs before the incident, though Betty, again, had family who had seen UFOs before, and so she was superficially familiar with the subject. Barney, of course, knew about this, but said he had never given the subject much serious thought, leaning towards believing that UFOs were probably all nonsense. This was part of why he was reluctant to pursue the story. He, in his own words, did not want to look foolish. Was this all a hoax? A story they invented? This seems unlikely, and was not the favored explanation of the government officials or scientists involved in this area, nor the multiple psychiatrists whom they consulted. For something this complex to have been a hoax, it would have required a great amount of planning, discussion, rehearsal, and persistence. Furthermore, there is a lack of a clear motive. They did not get rich off this scheme, and in fact spent $1,200 plus transportation and a half a year's worth of Saturdays on these hypnosis sessions. Did they do it for fame? Well, you can't say they didn't achieve that, but their, especially Barney's desire to remain out of the limelight, and their, especially Betty's obsession with the topic, seems to have been genuine. The hoax explanation cannot be ruled out, but it does not seem to be the most likely explanation. I think the Hills genuinely believed that this happened to them. But did it? No one involved in the investigation, including various psychiatrists, believed the Hills suffered from any form of mental illness that would cause them to lose touch with reality. They had no other indications of mental illness and had no other known incidents like this in their past. It was considered that something in their environment may have triggered hallucinations. Multiple influences, like a nitrate fertilizer stored in their car, were considered, but the lack of any other reported symptoms is a problem for any explanation relying on the presence of any mind-altering substance in the environment. They were sober, and there was no evidence of the use of anything else apart from caffeine and tobacco. Dr. Simon believed that their sighting of the unidentified object was probably real, and that it probably did have a profound emotional impact on them, though he didn't venture to try to explain exactly what they had seen. Again, he believed the more adventurous parts of their story were the products of what were likely disturbing dreams inspired by the sighting that were recalled as false memories. 10 days after the incident, Betty had intense dreams that were strikingly similar to what she recalled under hypnosis. She informed a coworker about the dreams, who convinced her that they might be real, repressed memories, and that she should record them. This suggestion from her coworker, he believed, encouraged her along this line of thinking. As Betty recalled her dreams to the investigators, with Barney overhearing her do so time after time, Simon argued they may have convinced their subconscious minds that these events were real. She was a very headstrong person, and could have potentially convinced the much more suggestible Barney of these things. Then, hypnosis may have brought these dreams more to surface in a very lifelike way, thereby solidifying these false memories and convincing them that they were true. Simon was encouraged in this conclusion by the fact that Betty's experience was much more thorough than Barney's. He also argued that the incident had many dreamlike qualities, such as its bizarre nature, which included certain contradictions. For example, one big question he had is how the beings knew English, or at least how to communicate meaning to humans telepathically, but not very basic things about our world, like what years or colors or vegetables were. Another contradiction was how it seemed that they did not understand human units of time, but, as Barney himself pointed out, they used phrases like, "Wait a minute." It is entirely possible that they came from a world that is extraordinarily different from ours, and even that they conceptualized the universe very differently, and so these things were not immediately obvious. But they clearly did know enough about our world to abduct Betty and Barney without witnesses in an almost perfect way, and yet the concept of false teeth seemed beyond them. Another important point made by Martin Kottmeyer was that while Betty didn't know much about UFOs before the incident, she did start reading about them before she had her dreams. A question many probably are wondering is, how legitimate is hypnosis? There definitely is something to it, but it's a complex topic which is not well understood, and most of it, especially how it pertains to memory recall, is a subject of debate. As Simon himself conceded, it is not a truth serum nor any kind of mental glasses that help a patient distinguish reality from fiction. Though altered, the mind is still aware of what it's being asked, and will lie or maintain a fiction of which the person has convinced themselves if it really wants to. It is not proven that hypnosis actually helps people recall things more accurately, and while it may be able to recover memories which were blocked under hypnosis, it also has a concerningly strong ability to strengthen or even create false memories. Hypnosis has sent innocent people to jail by reinforcing false memories in crime victims. Long story short, the hypnosis sessions cannot be considered the end of the story, and as professional and cautious as Dr. Simon was, it is possible that they created an even bigger fiction. Simon was fairly convinced of his explanation, even saying on national television, quote, "It was a fantasy. The abduction did not happen," end quote. However, there are very obvious problems with this explanation, which Dr. Simon himself admitted. Firstly, the Hills had conscious memories of profoundly unusual things the morning after the incident, before they had gone to sleep, including close-up memories of the craft and the beings in the window. They also had very vague memories of some kind of glowing orange roadblock and a moon leaving in the sky. Furthermore, even if we accept that the dreams were fictional, false memories that filled in the missing 2 hours and 35 miles, then how did they lose those 2 hours and 35 miles? Secondly, while hearing about Betty's dreams may have influenced Barney's memory, he also had a number of experiences that Betty did not. At no point under hypnosis did Barney recall a detail that Betty shared of which he should not have been aware because he was not present, or vice versa. They each recalled their own story from their own perspectives, in a way that would be consistent with it being something that had actually happened. Walter Webb pointed out that their experience connected like puzzle pieces to the periods they remembered before and after the blackout. Furthermore, while their personality differences could have led to Betty transferring her dreams onto Barney, it is also worth considering that, if it were real, because of these same personality differences, you would expect Betty to remember more because she wanted to, while Barney tried to block it all out. Thirdly, there was some physical evidence, like the torn dress, the stopped watches, the warts, and the spots on their car, although not all, but most of this evidence was not very well documented or clearly presented, to be fair, and none of it was anything along the lines of a smoking gun. Indeed, the story I have just told is a tough nut to crack. The question is, however, how accurate is this story? Among the prominent critics of the case was the writer and skeptic Robert Schaefer. In 1980, he published the book The UFO Verdict, examining the evidence, providing many details within which very much shook things up. Firstly, the timeline of events is not as substantial as it is presented. In the main story, they claim they saw the UFO a little after 10 p.m. In one of their initial reports to a member of NICAP, however, they claimed it happened after midnight. During a radio interview, noted in the book The Edge of Reality, they said the UFO started moving towards them at 3 in the morning. Regardless of whether this happened shortly after 10 p.m. or not, as James D. McDonald, a researcher from the area who meticulously retraced their journey, pointed out, they were probably overestimating their speed in certain parts and underestimated the time it took to travel to different points along the journey and to their home. After Colebrook, he said, there are no good time ticks. Because of how important the lost 2 hours are to this case, it is a very big problem that they don't appear to have been sure about when exactly these things took place, especially given that they said they only fully realized that they had lost time after they were grilled on the question by researchers. Just to note, this James D. McDonald who retraced their journey is separate from the Major James McDonald who interviewed them. Regarding the light in the sky, McDonald pointed out that there is an aircraft warning beacon on top of Cannon Mountain, which actually resembles what the Hills described very closely. Looking through binoculars, the beacon light may have illuminated part of the roof of the lookout tower, which could resemble a craft. This may be one of, or the main object, which they mistook for a UFO. Furthermore, he pointed out that it says in their book that the hills could not tell at first if it or they were the ones moving. Confusingly, the couple did mention a beacon on top of Cannon Mountain in Interrupted Journey, but they were referring to the light of a restaurant. The restaurant was closed, but the lights to the soda machines were still on. Thus, we can account for 2 man-made lights in a scene in which the hills described seeing only 2 lights. There was also a billboard advertisement for the Jack-o'-lantern Resort and a giant jack-o'-lantern built on top of the hotel, which the hills would have passed present at the time. MacDonald proposed one of these may have been the large orange moon shape they saw. But could people really mistake such simple things for UFOs? Yes, frequently. Okay, but this was not a mere sighting of a light in the sky. Consciously, before sleeping, they recalled the craft moving. They saw lights flashing along it. They saw it up close. They saw men in the windows. Could these things really have been the trigger of the fantastic experiences which followed the initial sighting? I have stated multiple times that there was nothing in the hills' background prior to the incident that would have suggested that they were excitable or imaginative people whom one would expect to run off with fantasies. However, it must be said that there were many things after the incident that drew their, specifically Betty's, reliability as a witness into question. Barney passed away in 1969. Betty continued to share her experience and investigate the case for decades after this on her own. However, according to Martin, she turned away from skeptical and cautious analysis of the UFO subject after Barney's death. She claimed to have had numerous, possibly hundreds, of UFO sightings and encounters throughout the rest of her life, some of which rivaled her own initial incident. In the late 70s, Betty claimed to have found a UFO hotspot in East Kingston, to which she often ventured to spot UFOs, seeing so many that she categorized them into different types. She claimed that the extraterrestrials had become much less friendly by the 70s. In one incident, she claimed they chased her and even blistered the paint of her car after shooting a laser beam at her. In another incident, she asserted that she had witnessed extraterrestrials land, get out of their craft, do calisthenics, then re-enter and leave. These are only some of the very bizarre claims she made over the years. UFO researchers, many of whom believed her story, accompanied her on her UFO hunting trips. However, when they, as was often reported, found her labeling everything she saw, including streetlights, as alien ships, the belief they had in her stories started to fade. In one incident, in 1980, Betty gave a presentation to a conference in New York City in which she presented pictures of UFOs she had taken over the years. There were scores, possibly, Schaefer, who attended the event said, hundreds of pictures, most of them being blurry and difficult to make out. Her claims and photographs were reportedly so unbelievable that she was, as he put it, jeered off the stage by other UFO enthusiasts. These incidents are obviously not recalled to mock or insult Mrs. Hill, they are undoubtedly relevant. In the eyes of many, they destroyed her credibility. She certainly isn't the only person to make such bold claims, but the problem is she was actually witnessed making severe errors in judgment, and not just by skeptics, but by people you could call believers. This is a major issue, because so much of the story depends on the position that the Hills were reliable, pragmatic, cautious witnesses. Betty's health had begun declining not long after the abduction. Her declining health may very well have influenced her escalation of unusual claims, but it is worth considering that this had begun by 1961. At the same time, however, Martin noted that towards the end of her life, Betty expressed frustration with the UFO community for its lack of cautiousness and skepticism, and turned away from the more improbable areas of the subject. Point being, it's not as if she had no regard for any caution whatsoever. Whatever the case, it is true that these points apply mostly only to Betty, not clearly Barney. Yes, but this provides much more weight to the point that Betty was the source of the false interpretations and memories, and that she transferred them onto Barney. While Barney may have been much more cautious, he did suffer from anxiety, according to his psychiatrists, and it is a simple fact that things like anxiety and depression can alter perception and even increase the likelihood of hallucinating a kind of supernatural experience. That alone doesn't discount his experience, but it is an important detail. Consider that a panic attack was triggered in Barney by Betty's excitement, that his reluctance to pursue the subject was a subconscious way of avoiding that anxiety, and that his vacillation between not being sure of whether or not it happened was not only a product of him trying to block it out, but of some subconscious awareness that it did not. But it was argued that Barney had no history of reacting to stress like this. This may be true, but ultimately, there is no such thing as a perfectly reliable witness. All of us are vulnerable to the tricks our minds play on us, especially when encouraged by the perspective of another. Adding to this, it is worth noting, MacDonald pointed out that the Hills had been driving for around 21 hours at the time of the sighting, throwing in the possibility of sleep deprivation and exhaustion influencing their perception. Regarding lost memories, MacDonald also pointed out, the Hills remembered every major town and landmark they would have passed. The rest of it, he said, was dark, monotonous countryside, easily forgettable to a drowsy driver. However, the Hills were both very adamant that they did not fall asleep or even come near falling asleep. But what about the physical evidence? There was not much physical evidence left, and most of it does not seem to have been examined professionally. There were a few exceptions, however. One was Betty's dress. As I mentioned, the morning after the incident, Betty took her stained and torn dress off, put it away, then forgot about it. 3 years later, after hypnosis, she recalled it and brought it out again. There was an odd pink powder on her dress and her dress alone. The dress was most deeply saturated with the substance in the areas in which she claimed they had touched her. The powder blew away when she hung it on a clothesline, but the stain remained. 5 different laboratories conducted chemical and forensic analysis on the dress. They detected a substance that was considered to be biological in origin, but which did not originate from her or Barney. It was declared anomalous and never identified. Another element of the case that was the subject of quite a bit of debate was Betty's star map, the recreation of the one which the leader had shown her. In 1968, an elementary school teacher named Marjorie Fish began working to identify the stars on the map using a 3D model of nearby sun-like stars she constructed. She argued that if this star here represents our sun, then this, the busiest and biggest circle on the map, must be the Zeta Reticuli system. Her proposed solution was published, but it was not convincing to everyone. Carl Sagan demonstrated in his documentary series Cosmos that if you remove the lines from Betty's star map and Fish's star map, the resemblance between the two is largely lost. Later, it was demonstrated by people like Charles W. Atterberg that other star patterns could be considered as well. In fact, Atterberg found a star pattern that fit more closely with Betty's than Fish's. Betty's star map included 26 stars. Fish identified 15 and ignored the other 11. Atterberg identified 25. In the 1990s, it was revealed that some of the stars that Fish considered were much further away than scientists knew at the time. With this new information, the map no longer worked, and Fish retracted her hypothesis. The Betty and Barney Hill case endures, 60 years later, as one of the most mysterious and captivating reported encounters with extraterrestrials ever publicized. Its allure, of course, rests in the fact that there remains a possibility that these things truly happened. Did they? It must be said that the counter-arguments made against it are quite substantial. However, it must also be said that there are certain mysterious elements of the story for which there is not a satisfactory counter-explanation. It must be admitted, if it were only something like a dream, then their dream-inspired false memories were impressively consistent and well put together. However, the fact that 2 stories are consistent does not make them true, and the fact that something cannot be disproven does not make it true either. The Hills were only 2 people, and the evidence they produced was very limited and vague. Almost everything is based on the claims made in their story. As witnesses, they, specifically Betty, had a habit of seeing spectacular fantasies in what other witnesses said were ordinary things, and the story they present while consistent in many ways, does also have a number of holes in it. Regardless, real or not, memory of the incident, I think, is worth preserving. The story paved the way for thousands and thousands of such stories to emerge, making it either a central piece of what could be regarded as an American UFO mythology, or one of the first steps towards discovering that we are being visited by people from elsewhere. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, I invite you to come check out the rest of Fire of Learning, especially my other campfire videos, such as my video on Kelly Hopkinsville, which I personally think was an even more mysterious story, and to subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. To support the channel, you may make a donation on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. A special thanks to my current patrons listed here. I also run a science channel much like this called Lucinox, so be sure to check that out too. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us next time around the campfire.
Happy Monday, everyone. It's November 26th, 2018. Have you started your holiday shopping yet? Can't believe we're less than a month away. It's me, John Lorden, here with another episode of Brain Scratch Case Cracked. Now, last week's episode, we went for a bit of a heartwarming story where a woman was found after 10 years of being missing by her family. This week, we're looking into a very different type of case for Case Cracked. Can you take an account of an alien abduction story and really crack that case, prove it or disprove it? I don't know, but we're going to try on today's case. This is the Allagash abduction. August 20th, 1976. Art students Charlie Foltz, Chuck Rack, and twins Jack and Jim Weiner met at the Massachusetts College of Art and wanted to take a vacation together before starting off on their careers. From Boston, they traveled to Allagash Waterway, a network of canals and lakes in the mountains of Maine. With 128 square miles and less than 500 people living there at the time, Allagash was a great place to get away from life and reconnect with nature. A beautiful area, reported to be like going back 1,000,000 years in time, to spot bull moose, blue herring, loons, and eagles. But these four men would claim to spot something else while on this trip. 2 days into the trip, they were at Chamberlain Lake at dusk. They came across several other campers, including some fathers that were worried about their sons who were on the lake in a canoe. It would be getting dark soon, and the boys could be in real trouble if they got lost or couldn't find their way back to camp. As the men were scouring the horizon and calling out to the boys, they noticed a funny light a few miles away moving over the treetops. They used binoculars and concluded that it had to be some type of aircraft emitting a velvety yellow light. After 30 seconds, the light just disappeared, winking out like a giant camera iris closed on it. Thankfully, they then spotted their sons canoeing back towards camp. With a sense of relief over the missing boys, the aircraft incident was quickly forgotten. A few days later, the four men were now at Smith Brook campsite at Eagle Lake. There were no other campers with them, and they wanted to do some night fishing. Not wanting to put themselves into a similar situation as the boys on their canoe, the men started a campfire so they could find their way back to camp after they were done out on the water. Charlie was in the front of the canoe, the twins were in the middle, and Chuck was in the back. Chuck exclaims, "Holy mackerel, what the heck is that?" The men state they saw a bright yellow light that appeared to be rising from the tree line. They once again assumed it was an airplane, but then realized there was no sound. It was just alive, describes Charlie Foltz. The object paused about 100 yards away. Charlie shined his flashlight at the object, and the object emitted a beam of light back at them. It lit up the entire 16-foot canoe. The men believed it was trying to communicate with them and that it was getting closer. Quote, So we thought, this is real. This is really happening. This is not a figment of our imagination. We've got to deal with this situation now because within a few seconds, this thing is going to be right on us, stated Jack Weiner. The men started paddling away as Jack kept saying, it's getting closer, it's getting closer. Chuck saw the UFO change course, now flying away from them, and it eventually faded away into the night sky. I thought, well, that's it. We lost our chance. We let it slip through our fingers, said Chuck. They made it back to camp, but the fire they built to be their beacon was now just a pile of embers. The men didn't discuss what happened that night and didn't talk about what happened to the fire. They just went to sleep. Even after the trip, they really didn't discuss it. One of them would comment, it's almost like they were programmed to not talk about it. In 1978, Jim Weiner had an accident, taking a fall of 14 feet and breaking his back in several places. He was now dealing with temporal epilepsy, having seizures on occasion, as well as suffering from sleep deprivation. He found himself having nightmares. Nightmares about being experimented on by non-human figures. After dealing with this for a few years, he eventually confided in his brother Jack about the nightmares, not expecting to hear that Jack was seeing the same visions in his dreams. Jim opened up to his doctors about his dreams, and eventually a psychiatrist heard about them and stated that it sounded like an abduction experience. Jim met UFO researcher Ray Fowler at a UFO conference. Ray has had a prolific career in the UFO research field, writing several books, acting as director of scientific investigations for MUFON and chairman of NICAP. He also claims to be an abductee himself. He listened to Jim's story and believed he was recalling true events that had been repressed in his memory. Eventually, all four men would undergo regression hypnosis, and new details about what happened on the pond that night came out. The light approached them. They were paddling away, Jack yelling, "They're gaining on us." Jack then recalls seeing a tube of light and then looking to the back of the canoe and seeing that Chuck was gone. He scanned the water, wondering if Chuck fell off the canoe, but there was no sign of him. He looked back up at the UFO and describes an intense feeling like coming apart or something. That's the only way I can describe it. The next thing he recalls is lying on his back in a hazy environment, the same hazy environment he's been dreaming about for several years. Charlie has the same recollection, winding up on his back as well, but he remembers struggling to try to get up. He stops when a face appears looking straight down at him with giant, dark, almond-shaped eyes. The men describe their captors as looking like insects with eyes like an ant has and wearing spandex clothing. Jim also noticed their hands were much different than ours, with no single opposable thumb, but 4 opposable fingers. And according to pictures the art students drew, it was holding an object that made him more than nervous, a 14-inch wand. Quote, "I didn't like the looks of it. I remember thinking, oh boy, here we go, this is it. I've got 5 seconds to live. They're going to cut me open. They're going to dissect me. I just want to get out of here. Get me out of here." The men remember being experimented on, moved to another room, and then being placed back in the canoe. They state the aliens were literally standing in the canoe and water, trying to place the men in the same positions as when they were teleported up. Chuck recalls seeing them struggle with Jim, and after not being able to place him properly, the aliens beamed Jack and Charlie directly onto the land near their campsite. The men now realized why their campfire was out when they got back. They were missing 3 hours of time. It was stated in a television special called Abducted by UFOs that among UFO researchers, it is regarded as a reliable report with solid eyewitness testimony. A 2013 article published at the Portland Press Herald stated, "There is neither a fortune to be made nor fame to acquire." Charlie Foltz also once stated, "We have nothing to gain by this except public ridicule." However, With a quick look online, you can see that Jim and Charlie have done multiple conference appearances, appeared on The Joan Rivers Show, appeared in comic books, and have recently also done several online interviews, all while regularly promoting a book about the incident authored by Ray Fowler. Jack and Jim have a website called AllagashUFOTwins.com and sell artwork based on their story. It's reported that the proceeds go to help Jack fight multiple sclerosis. Chuck Rack fell away from the group a few decades ago, then spoke up in August 2016 with a very interesting revelation. The reason I supported this story at first was because I wanted to make money. Though he discounts the abduction story, he doesn't claim that the initial sightings of a light in the sky didn't happen. I had an uncomfortable feeling of being stared at. I turned around and saw this very, very bright globe of light in the sky, changing color from white to red to green in a liquid kind of melding motion. He says they even reported it to a ranger the following day, who dismissed it as lights coming from the grand opening of a hardware store. Quote, he said what we saw was these guys operating a searchlight in the back of a pickup. There's no way this could have been any hardware store grand opening at 9 o'clock at night coming from 75 miles away. Chuck states that the hypnosis sessions he underwent didn't give him any of the memories that the others were claiming, even though he initially said they did. We were compelled to stay together, all speculating that this thing could go into the millions of dollars for each of us. We made very little. I don't call it a hoax, just brilliant storytelling. It's not the truth, but I have to admire the storytelling ability of these guys. He also discounts the mystery of the campfire, saying that the largest of the logs was only 3.5 inches in diameter and would have burned off quickly. Foltz contradicts that statement. Some of the wood we put in there was the diameter of my leg. I would say at least a good 10 inches in diameter easily. Chuck Rack also states that some recreational drugs were in use. I remember being on the Joan Rivers Show. Joan was asking, were you guys drinking or taking drugs? Fortunately, I was sitting furthest away from her. Jim Weiner was right next to her, and he had to field that question and lie, and I didn't have to lie. Yeah, we were definitely stoned when we went out on the lake just before we got that sighting. Charlie Foltz claims that Chuck Rack has been banned from some UFO conventions and calls him a loose cannon and a mental disaster area, and he denies the drug use, saying they only had an 8-pack of beer with him. Jim Weiner suggests that Rack is hurt by losing his friends and lashing out at them. Ray Fowler concurs that Rack didn't have the same memories come out of regression hypnosis. He's the type of person who needs to be in control. He was not happy not being able to have detailed recall of the abduction portion of the incident. Thus, several years after the investigation, he claimed that no one was abducted. Chuck Rack states that he feels free now that he's told the truth, but doesn't discount the possibility of life out there. I'm completely open-minded about it. It's just, I don't think it happened in our case. Case cracked? Or are we talking about a butthurt friend that's lashing out at his former friends decades later? I don't know, guys. I think this one is up to you. But I did want to share it with you because it's pretty rare that you find an episode of an alien abduction where someone comes out later and says that it never happened. As a matter of fact, I think this is the only one that I'm aware of where we have one of the abductees saying that it doesn't happen. Typically, the abductees stick to their story and write books, do appearances, and that just kind of continues. And we do have a few of the abductees doing that in this case. But Chuck, it's strange. I haven't found a whole lot of falling out information, whatever caused this rift in the group. Ray Fowler did say at one point that Chuck was talking to the group about potentially lying to people, saying that it was a scam to try to foster interest, and then they would say it wasn't a scam to try to pull it back, and that he thought that in the attention that maybe they could make a lot of money. Essentially, the story that he's claiming the other guys have of, hey, we're all going to make money on this together, is now kind of coming back at him from some of the guys saying, no, Chuck was the one that was talking about, trying to manipulate the public to make money in some way on this. But it's weird because if you look at clips from that initial television special, which looks like it was produced back in the 80s, you have the men actually talking about their own experience. That's where a lot of the quotes came from. But I also listened to a recent interview with two of the men, and the experiences that they're describing pretty different. Like in that piece in the early 80s, it sounds like they're really sticking to the story that they just saw this thing in the sky, they paddled away from it, and it disappeared. In their later versions of the story, it kind of turns into, no, it followed them all the way back to camp. And obviously, once they have the regression hypnosis done, then they put the pieces together that they were actually abducted in the middle of that, and the aliens put them back over on camp. You also hear other details where I think it's Charlie Foltz now says, well, I actually looked at my watch at the time and I noticed that 3 hours had kind of vanished. And you hear different details about, did they really talk about this? Did they not talk about this? In some of the later details, you're hearing that they actually talked about it the next day. And that's coming from the guys that are still supporting the story. What's interesting about that is that lines up with what Chuck was saying, where he said he talked to a park ranger the next day and kind of reported it. So this whole touch of they possibly could have been programmed to not talk about this for some reason, I don't know if I really put too much into that either. There's a lot going on in this story where if you look at the different versions that have been told over the years, they're not hard major contradictions, but the details are certainly changing quite a bit. In the earlier versions, the wand that I described is actually a needle, which kind of supports the statement that he's making about being worried about being cut open. But then in the later versions and in some of the artwork they've put out, all of a sudden that needle has turned into a wand where there's actually a round bulb at the tip of it. So why would you have been scared of being cut open by that item previously if you saw it had a big round bulb at the tip? I don't know. I'm very skeptical of the story, but it's interesting to hear that we have one of the men that's saying, no, all that was completely made up. We did see something weird in the sky, but all the abduction stuff, who knows? And from what I've looked into before, the whole regression hypnosis thing is not... it's not a science that can really be leaned on very strongly. I think it's used in kind of psychology or psychiatry, one of those fields, a little bit in terms of helping treat people. But in terms of it actually being a recall device for trying to get to memories and stuff like that, I think if you look into it a bit more, you might find that there's information that kind of refutes it. There's other information that supports it a little bit, but I haven't been able to find a very strong conclusion of, is that actually a good device for recall, or can you suggest things to people? Are people suggestible in that state? Which, based off typical conventions of hypnosis, you would think, yeah, people are probably somewhat suggestible in that state. Before we move on to comments from last week's episode, I have to thank a bunch of new patrons. Thank you guys so much. Really just an amazing week for Patreon. Holly Overton, now a patron. Tabitha Black also joining. Julia Oliver, Marnie Peters, Charlotte Rothmeyer. Hi, Charlotte. Natalie Warren. Hello, Natalie. And finally, Derek Damasi. On top of that, we also had several people increase their pledges. Thank you so much. Amy Ristad, Danielle S., and Mario Romani. I really appreciate you guys supporting me and helping to keep me here and doing the great things that we're doing together on the channel. It's really, really touching. Speaking of touching, seems like a lot of you really appreciated last week's Case Crack, the story of who is Mary Roberts. If you missed that, I'll have a link to it in the description box below. Let's go ahead and jump into some of your comments about this. Mahatma Kane Jeeves says, this hits close to home because I was homeless for years. I always was scared of being murdered or dying and the cops not even trying to do anything because I was just, quote, another homeless piece of, I'll put the word crap in there, which I heard a cop say. I will never criticize Christians because they were the main people who helped and cared and would pray with me anytime they saw me. One beautiful lady gave me a movie ticket, which was amazing at that time. I obviously wasn't going to the movies, LOL. It was a nice break. I will never forget them. Oh, I just wanted to mention giving clean new socks was one of my favorite presents given. If anyone wants to help, that is something that every homeless person needs badly. You just begin to not even feel human after a while. It's not an easy life, especially the older you are. Thank you so much for sharing that story with us and giving us some more insight into there. And I will certainly be thinking about donating socks. I think that's a really interesting insight and a really good point. And I hope many of you out there will consider doing the same. Joe Kulik brings up an interesting aspect on this. It's a great story, but consider the possibility that someone could be wrongfully convicted of a murder in a situation just like this one. I wonder how many wrongfully convicted husbands are sitting in prison right now because they were married to a Mary Roberts. The most improbable part of the story is that she was actually reunited with her family. In the more common case, where a Mary Roberts never gets help, a loved one could be sitting in prison for her murder while she is wandering around with amnesia. Really interesting point, Joe. And I could see it going both ways. You might have a man that's in this situation. The wife could be accused as well. I do know, at least from the cases I've looked into, that a murder conviction where there isn't a body, it does happen, but it's not extremely common. However, that's not to say that just the pressure or dealing with the fact that you're being accused of doing something to your missing spouse or a missing loved one isn't terrible to go through and might have an outcome very similar to this. So yeah, I'm with you. There is definitely an aspect to this where it could be very harmful to a person and their life and could easily tear a family apart, something along those lines. And you've kind of got me wondering, thinking about cases I've covered, are there any cases I've covered where that could possibly be going on? We certainly have the setup in several of those cases where it could be something like this. Uber Urbana says, it is so sad that in our country, the police are not well trained on how to deal with those who are homeless, those with mental issues, etc. Every homeless person out there was once someone's child or brother or sister. I know addicts, and I don't know of one who woke up one day actually looking forward to being addicted to something. But if they are, they need help. They don't need to be criticized for being in that place in life. They need compassion and a reason for hope. If one has no hope, no forward goal, I feel that all else dies. Yeah, that's one of the things that I was really touched by this story as well, was learning about these departments that they have in Santa Barbara to actually help with this. I'd never heard of those types of sub-departments being within police and court services before. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to share this story as well. There's some really good ideas going on about how to treat these situations. Outside of the fact that you just had a community of people that rallied around her and really supported her the best they could until she was able to come up with the answer that everyone was looking for. But I do hope that more police departments will consider taking on these types of departments and this type of approach. Because you're right, I think there could be a lot more compassion, particularly in metropolitan areas, but all over the place when it comes to dealing with homeless. Maria Lara says, I have always taught my children to treat the homeless with respect and dignity. I tell them that every person has a story, and you really never know why or how people become homeless. I will share this story with them to show the importance of treating all the way one would like to be treated. Maria, thank you so much, and it really lights me up inside to know that you're going to share this with them, and just to think of how this story touches other people and motivates them in ways to try to make this world a better place. So that means the world to me. Thank you. And thanks to everyone it was just such a good, positive comment stream on this story. I really appreciate it. And I'm really thankful that you guys saw the same positivity and light that I did in it. So it was really a joy to read through all those. Take care, everyone. I'll see you back here on Wednesday with a brand new episode of Brain Scratch Searchlight.
Hi, I'm Bob Lazar. During late 1988 and early 89, I worked on the propulsion systems of extraterrestrial vehicles for the United States government. The hardware and technology I was exposed to should be placed in the proper hands of the scientific community, and it is the right of every person on Earth to know that there is physical evidence which proves that there is life elsewhere and that at least one form of that life has been here. For those of you whose information about me is limited to this video, I'll give you a brief background. I'm a physicist. I have degrees in physics and electronics technology. I've worked in a number of scientific programs, some of which require top secret and above top secret security clearances, of which the most easily verifiable is my early 1980s job here at the Los Alamos Mason Physics Facility in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Between December of '88 and April of '89, I worked as a senior staff physicist in what has to be the most secret project in history. My place of work was a facility at an area known as S4 on the Nellis Air Force Range in central Nevada. Area S4 is located approximately 15 miles south of the infamous Area 51 installation at Groom Lake, where the U-2 and SR-71 spy planes were developed. For the duration of my employment at S4, I was paid by the United States Navy. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to segregate the information contained here into two separate parts. The first part will deal with information with which I've had hands-on experience and personal instruction. In other words, not only did I read briefings and not only was I taught the theories of these technologies, but they were demonstrated for me and I know they are true and accurate. Some of the points covered in this first section will be how vast distances of space are traveled by virtue of an intense gravitational field, how this gravitational field is generated, what the power source is and how it functions, and general information about disks and the project at S4. The second part of this will deal with subjects on which I've read supporting information, yet for the most part I had no other way to corroborate the information or ascertain its accuracy. When we get to part two, it will be obvious why proof of some of this information could not be conclusive. Some of the points covered in this second section will be information about the beings that brought us this technology, and how these beings have historically interacted with man. I've been prudent in selecting what to expose here, and I think that some of this information should not be made available to the general public. This information is being conveyed to you as it was to me, with the exception that in most cases I've simplified things for those of you with non-scientific and non-technological backgrounds. So let's begin. At the beginning of this first section, I'm going to give you 3 short science lessons, and once you've learned them, you'll not only know more about interstellar travel than almost anyone else in the world, but you'll know the actual method another civilization is used to travel from another star system to the planet Earth. Now, during the course of this, I'm going to have to relate information that I've learned at S4 to information that we're already aware of. And when I say we, I mean the general mainstream scientific community. So as not to waste too much time explaining established scientific facts and theories, when I say we know this or we know that, please feel free to consult any qualified scientist, professor, or science teacher to have them explain my statements to you. One of the most predominantly asked questions is, how is it possible to cross vast expanses of space without exceeding the speed of light? Or how can you travel in reasonable time and economy between points that are light years apart? Now, keep in mind that the speed of light is 186,000 miles a second, which translates into roughly 669 million miles an hour. And a light year is the distance traveled in 1 year at the speed of light. Proxima Centauri, which is the star system nearest ours, would take 4 years to reach traveling at the speed of light. So up until now, when we've examined the requirements to travel these distances, we've always had to consider the problems of traveling at a speed near the speed of light. This poses problems with propulsion, navigation, fuel capacities, and even when you consider the effects of acceleration on space-time, which include time dilation, mass increase, length contraction, and a whole host of other things, it quickly becomes evident that this type of travel would require a level of technology that man has not yet achieved. The truth of the matter is that traveling these distances does require a level of technology that man has not yet achieved. but it has nothing to do with flying in a linear mode near the speed of light. We know that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, so in our universe we've always assumed that the fastest way from point A to B was to travel in a straight line at the speed of light. Well, the fact is that when you're dealing with space-time and you enjoy the capability of generating an intense gravitational field, the fastest way from point A to B is to distort or warp or bend the space-time between point A and B, bringing point A and B closer together. The more intense the gravitational field, the greater the distortion of space-time and the shorter the distance between points A and B. Most of us think of space-time as the void or as nothing. And remember, it wasn't that long ago that man considered the air in our atmosphere to be nothing. Yet with time, we've become aware of the elements and properties of the air and atmosphere. Well, indeed, space-time is an entity, and one of its properties is that it can be distorted or bent by a gravitational field. We know that gravity bends or distorts space-time and light by virtue of the fact that we're able to see stars which we know should be blocked from our view by the sun. Referring to the graphic here, the solid line denotes the position of a star that's located behind the sun, and the dotted line shows its position as viewed from Earth. This is made possible because the sun's gravitational field distorts the space-time and light around the sun, allowing us to view stars which should be hidden from view. We know that gravity distorts time by virtue of the fact that if we take two identical atomic clocks and keep one at sea level and take the other one up to a high altitude, when we bring them both back together, they reflect different times. The difference in this passage of time is caused by the fact that a gravitational field weakens the further you get from the source. So the atomic clock which was taken to the high altitude was exposed to a less powerful gravitational field than the clock which we kept at sea level. The effect of a gravitational field on space-time is something that we've been able to observe, but not to experiment with. This is due to our inability to generate a gravitational field. And up until this point in time, great mass such as a star, planet, or moon was the only source of a discernible gravitational field that we're aware of. So just as the gravitational field around great mass such as a planet distorts space and time, any gravitational field, whether naturally occurring or generated, distorts space and time in a similar manner. Now, the great benefit of generating an intense gravitational field is not only can you turn it on, but you can turn it off. If we refer back to our original illustration of space-time distortion, we can see that when we generate an intense gravitational field, we can distort the space-time and in turn the distance between the point where we are and the point where we want to be. We can then position ourselves at the point where we want to be and then stop generating the gravitational field, allowing space-time to return to its natural form. In this manner, we can travel great distances with little linear movement, and this is how space-time distortion translates into reduced distance. Now back to our original question, how is it possible to cross the vast expanses of space required for interstellar travel without exceeding the speed of light? This is accomplished by generating an intense gravitational field, distorting space-time and allowing you to cross many light years of space in little or no time and without traveling in a linear mode near the speed of light. The next question is, how do you generate a gravitational field? Up until this point in time, I've used the term generate to describe the capability of producing a gravitational field, but since I'm not aware of any way of creating a gravitational field from nothing, a more accurate term might be to access and amplify a gravitational field. And this is what I mean when I use the term generate. To understand how gravity is generated or accessed and amplified, you must first know what gravity is. There are two main theories. The wave theory, which states that gravity is a wave, and the currently accepted theory of gravitons, which are alleged subatomic particles that perform as gravity, which is total nonsense. Well, gravity is a wave, and there are two specific different types of gravity, gravity A and gravity B. Gravity A works on a small or micro scale, while gravity B works on a large or macro scale. We are familiar with gravity B. It is the big gravity wave that holds the Earth as well as the rest of the planets in orbit around the Sun and holds the Moon as well as man-made satellites in orbit around the Earth. We are not familiar with gravity A. It is the small gravity wave which is the major contributory force that holds together the mass that makes up all protons and neutrons. Gravity A is what is currently being labeled as the strong nuclear force in mainstream physics, and gravity A is the wave that you need to access and amplify to enable you to cause space-time distortion for interstellar travel. To keep them straight, just remember that gravity A works on an atomic scale, and gravity B is the big gravity wave that works on a stellar or planetary level. However, don't mistake the size of these waves for their strength, because gravity A is a much stronger force than gravity B. You can momentarily break the gravity B field of the Earth simply by jumping in the air. So this is not an intense gravitational field. Locating gravity A is no problem because it is found in the nucleus of every atom of all matter here on Earth, and all matter anywhere else in our universe. However, accessing gravity A with the naturally occurring elements found on Earth is a big problem. Actually, I'm not aware of any way of accessing the gravity A wave using any Earth elements, whether naturally occurring or synthesized, and here's why. We've already learned that gravity A is the major force that holds together the mass that makes up protons and neutrons. This means the gravity A wave we are trying to access is virtually inaccessible, as it is located within matter, or at least within the matter that we have here on Earth. However, the Earth is not representative of all matter within our universe. The residual matter which remains after the creation of a solar system is totally dependent on the contributing factors which were present during the creation of the solar system. This is true whether you believe that the origin of the universe was an evolutionary event or that a supreme being caused this event to happen. The two main factors which determine what residual matter remains after the creation of a solar system are the amount of electromagnetic energy and the amount of mass present during the solar system's creation. Our solar system has one star, which is our sun, but the majority of solar systems in our Milky Way galaxy are binary and multiple star systems. In fact, many single star systems have stars that are so large that our sun would appear to be a dwarf by comparison. Keeping all this in mind, it should be obvious that a large single star system, binary star system, or multiple star system would have had more of the prerequisite mass and electromagnetic energy present during their creations. This makes it possible for these systems to possess elements which are not native to the Earth. Scientists have long theorized that there are potential combinations of protons and neutrons which should provide stable elements with atomic numbers higher than any which appear in our periodic chart, though none of these heavy elements occur naturally on Earth. 88 of the first 92 elements on the periodic chart occur naturally on Earth. Some heavier elements do occur in trace amounts, but for the most part we synthesize these heavier elements in laboratories. Generally speaking, the stability of these synthesized heavy elements decreases as their atomic number increases, but experiments at the lab for heavy ion research in Germany have shown that this may only be true up to a certain point, as the half-life for element 109 is longer than that of element 108. The point is that our observations and theories are accurate. The fact is that heavier stable elements with higher atomic numbers, which have more protons, neutrons, and electrons than any Earth elements, do exist. However, up until this point in history, there has been no physical evidence to prove this. But now that proof is here. The most important attribute of these heavier stable elements is that the gravity A wave is so abundant that it actually extends past the perimeter of the atom. These heavier stable elements literally have their own gravity A field around them, in addition to the gravity B field that is native to all elements. No naturally occurring atoms on Earth have enough protons and neutrons for the cumulative gravity A wave to extend past the perimeter of the atom so you can access it. Even though the distance that the gravity A wave extends is infinitesimal, it is accessible, and it has amplitude, wavelength, and frequency just like any other wave in the electromagnetic spectrum. Once you can access the gravity A wave, you can amplify it just like we amplify any other electromagnetic wave. To demonstrate how a wave is amplified, we can use this oscilloscope, and as you can see, it graphically depicts the tone you hear as a wave. As we amplify the tone, you can see that the size or the amplitude of the wave increases, giving us a more powerful version of the same identical wave, and thus the tone sounds louder. In like manner, the gravity A wave is amplified and then focused on the desired destination to cause the space-time distortion required for space travel. This amplified gravity A wave is so powerful that the only naturally occurring source of gravity that could cause space-time to distort this much would be a black hole. This brings us back to our original question. How do you generate a gravitational field? You must have access to an element which is heavy enough for the gravity A wave to extend past the perimeter of the atom. Then you can access and amplify it for space-time distortion. To complete our 3 science lessons, the last question is, what is the power source for this type of travel? Well, for those of you with limited knowledge about power sources, I'm sure you can probably imagine the enormous amount of power required to cause a space-time distortion for this type of travel. After all, we're amplifying a wave that barely extends past the perimeter of an atom until it's large enough to distort vast amounts of space-time. For those of you with extensive knowledge about power sources, I'm sure it's probably even more puzzling as to how it's possible to have a compact, lightweight, onboard power source that can provide this much power. For everyone to understand that, I need to further explain a couple of things we briefly touched upon in the last question. If you remember, I said that for the most part, we synthesize or create heavier elements in accelerators, and their stability decreases as their atomic number increases. So what does this all mean? Well, we synthesize these heavier, unstable elements by using more stable elements as targets in a particle accelerator. We then bombard the target element with various atomic and subatomic particles. At this point, transmutation occurs, making the target element a different, heavier element. This element now has a higher atomic number, as the atomic number simply indicates the number of protons in the nucleus of the atom. So this is what I mean when I say their atomic number increases. What does their stability decreases mean? The length of time which an element exists before it decays determines its stability. Atoms of some elements decay faster than atoms of other elements, so the faster an element decays, the more unstable that element is considered to be. When an atom decays, it releases or radiates subatomic particles and energy, which is the radiation that a Geiger counter detects. As you can see, this Geiger counter is detecting the radiation from this uranium, which literally means that the Geiger counter is sensing the subatomic particles which are being released or radiated as the uranium decays. Those elements in which nuclear radiation can be consistently detected are radioactive elements. These heavy elements, which we synthesize in particle accelerators, are of the radioactive variety, and they decay very rapidly. Since we're only able to make a few atoms of these elements, and because they decay so rapidly, we're not able to observe much about them. This is what I mean when I say their stability decreases. However, there are elements with higher atomic numbers which are stable, even though they don't occur naturally on Earth, and we can synthesize them in particle accelerators. These are the elements in the 114, 115 range which don't appear on a periodic chart. Beyond element 115, the elements become unstable again, and in fact, element 116 decays in fractions of a second. This finally brings us to the power source. The power source is a reactor which uses this element 115 as its fuel. In this reactor, element 115 is used as a target and is bombarded with protons in a small particle accelerator. When a proton plugs into the nucleus of an atom of 115, it increases its atomic number and becomes an atom of element 116, which, remember, decays instantly. What element 116 releases as it decays, or what it radiates, is antimatter. What is antimatter? Antimatter is the exact counterpart of matter, which has a charge and a spin that is in the opposite of all matter. When combined with any matter in our universe, antimatter reacts and completely converts to energy. And remember, the rapid conversion of matter to energy is what we generally call an explosion. To demonstrate the explosive power of antimatter, let's pick a random area where an atomic bomb might explode. Oh, let's say Iraq. And for demonstration purposes, let's say an atomic bomb would explode, for instance, in, Baghdad. Well, if one of our older atomic bombs exploded in Baghdad, the area of total devastation, which is indicated by the red dot on the map, would be approximately 2 miles. This would be caused by a fission reaction in which less than 1% of the nuclear material is converted to energy. Most of you are familiar with the bombs that were dropped on Japan in World War II. This is the same bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki August 9, 1945. About this same time, Dr. Edward Teller, who's known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, figured out that a nuclear fusion bomb was possible. Fusion would release even more energy and cause an even bigger explosion from the same amount of nuclear material. Much to Dr. Teller's dismay, the Japanese surrendered, we never dropped the hydrogen bomb, and Dr. Teller has been in a bad mood ever since. But if a hydrogen bomb containing the same amount of nuclear material as the Nagasaki bomb were to explode in Baghdad, the area of total devastation would be approximately 20 miles. This would be caused by a nuclear fusion reaction, which again, less than 1% of the nuclear material actually converts to energy or explodes. The other 99% of the nuclear material on this type of bomb is dispersed, but is not involved in the actual nuclear fusion reaction. Now, if a bomb was made with the same amount of nuclear material as the Nagasaki bomb, and that material was antimatter, when that bomb exploded in Baghdad, the area of total devastation would include parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia, with the exact area of total devastation being very difficult to calculate. This would be caused by a total annihilation reaction, which is the complete conversion of matter to energy. 100% of the nuclear material in this bomb would explode or convert to energy. We currently have no practical way to harness antimatter into a bomb, and generally speaking, we can only isolate antimatter in a particle accelerator and store it for a short time. This demonstrates the enormous amount of power released when you totally convert matter to energy, which is what happens when antimatter and matter are combined. So back to our power source. Inside the reactor, element 115 is bombarded with a proton, which plugs into the nucleus of the 115 atom and becomes element 116, which immediately decays and releases or radiates small amounts of antimatter. The antimatter is released in a vacuum into a tuned tube, which keeps it from reacting with the matter that surrounds it. It is then directed towards a gaseous matter target at the end of the tube. The matter and antimatter collide and annihilate, totally converting to energy. The heat from this reaction is converted into electrical energy in a near 100% efficient thermoelectric generator. This is a device that converts heat directly into electrical energy. Many of our satellites and space probes use thermoelectric generators, but their efficiency is very, very low. All these actions and reactions inside of the reactor are orchestrated perfectly like a tiny little ballet. And in this manner, the reactor provides an enormous amount of power. So back to our original question. What is the power source that provides the power required for this type of travel? The power source is a reactor which uses element 115 as a fuel and uses a total annihilation reaction to provide the heat which it converts to energy, making it a compact, lightweight, efficient onboard power source. I've got a couple quick comments about element 115 for those of you who are interested. By virtue of the way it's used in the reactor, it depletes very slowly, and only 223 grams of 115, which is just under half a pound, can be utilized for a period of 20 to 30 years. Element 115's melting point is 1740 degrees Celsius. I need to state here that even though I had hands-on experience with element 115, I didn't melt any of it down, and I didn't use any of it for 20 to 30 years to see if it depleted. So we've learned how space-time is distorted by a gravitational field. We've learned how that gravitational field is generated, and we've also learned where you get the power to accomplish all of this. Now it's time to link all we've learned in our science lessons to the vehicle that utilizes all of this technology. And a few years ago, I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but that vehicle is a disk, which is generally referred to as a flying saucer. I had at least partial views of the 9 different disks out at Area S4, but the one I'm going to describe to you now is the one in which I not only saw 2 of the 3 interior levels, but I also saw it fully functional in flight. And no, unfortunately, I didn't get to go for a ride in it. This particular disc appeared to be in excellent condition, and because of its sleek appearance, I nicknamed it the Sport Model. The Sport Model is about 16 feet tall and 40 feet in diameter. The exterior skin of the disc is metal, which is the color of unpolished stainless steel. The Sport Model sits on its belly when it's not energized. As you can see, the hatch is located on the upper half of the disc with just the bottom portion of the door wrapping around the center lip of the disc. The interior level of the disc is divided into 3 levels. The lower level is where the 3 gravity amplifiers and amplifier guides are located. These are the things used to amplify and focus the gravity A wave that we learned about in our science lessons. The reactor is located directly above the 3 gravity amplifiers on the center level and is in fact centered between them. The reactor is similar to this half-scale model. The element 115 is machined into triangles like this and is then inserted into the reactor. This piece of element 115 is the source of the gravity A wave as well as the target that is bombarded with protons to release the antimatter, both of which we learned about in our science lessons. The center level of this disk also houses the control consoles and seats, both of which were too small and too low to the floor to be functional for adult human beings. The walls of the center level are all divided into archways. At one point in time, when the disk was energized, one of the archways became transparent, and you could see the area outside of it just as if the archway was a window. After the panel had been transparent for a while, a form of writing, which was unlike any alphabetic, scientific, or mathematical symbols I've ever seen, began to appear on the transparent archway. And I was never informed as to how all of this was achieved, not that any of that would have required alien technology. I was never given access to the upper level of the disk, so I can't enlighten you as to what the porthole-like areas are, other than I can assure you that they're not portholes. Now, before I go any further about the disk, I'm going to show you where and under what circumstances I saw it tested. My job in this program was to be part of a back engineering team. Back engineering is the act of taking a finished product and tearing it apart to find out what makes it tick. The goal in this program was to see if the technology of the disk could be duplicated with other materials. When I went to work, I was flown from McCarran Airport in Las Vegas to Area 51, which is a highly secure government base on the Nevada test site. Area 51 is located about 125 miles north of Las Vegas, near the Groom Mountains and the Groom Dry Lake bed. From Area 51, I was bused to an even more highly secure facility located about 15 miles south of Area 51 called S4. S4 is situated at the base of the Papoose Mountains by the Papoose Dry Lake bed. The airspace around S4 is restricted, and if any unwelcome aircraft strays into the outer sector, they radio the pilot and instruct him or her to leave. If that pilot continues and strays into the middle sector, jets will be scrambled to escort the intruding aircraft out. If for any reason whatsoever that aircraft penetrates into the inside sector before jets can be airborne, ground-to-air missiles will neutralize the intruder. The moral of this story is don't try and fly into S4. The S4 installation is built into the mountain, and the 9 hangar doors are angled at about 60 degrees. These doors are covered with a sand-textured coating to blend in with the side of the mountain and the desert floor. As you can see in this representation, my ID badge had a white background with 1 light blue and 1 dark blue diagonal stripe in the upper left-hand corner. At the bottom of the badge, there were letters and numbers designating various areas, including S4. On my badge, there was a star punch through S4. The back of the ID badge was dark blue with a vertical mag stripe running down one side. The hangar that housed the sport model was like a typical airplane hangar with the exception of the angled doors that I mentioned before. The hangar was equipped with typical tools and extensive electronic equipment. It also had a machine with an X-ray emblem on it and an overhead crane rated at 20,000 pounds. Equipment in this hangar was marked with a black number 41 with a white circle around it. It was outside of this hangar that I saw the sport model tested. Now, when the disk travels near another source of gravity, such as a planet or moon, it doesn't use the same mode of travel that we learned about in our science lessons. When a disk is near another source of gravity, like Earth, the gravity A wave, which propagates outward from the disk, is phase shifted into the gravity B wave, which propagates outward from the Earth, and this creates lift. The gravity amplifiers of the disk can be focused independently, and they are pulsed and do not stay on continuously. When all 3 of these amplifiers are being used for travel, they're in the delta configuration, and when only one is being used for travel, it's in the omicron configuration. As the intensity of the gravitational field around the disk increases, the distortion of space-time around the disk also increases. And if you could see the space-time distortion, this is how it would look. As you can see, as the output of the gravitational field from the amplifiers becomes more intense, the form of space-time around the disk not only bends upward, but at maximum distortion actually folds over into almost a heart shape around the top of the disk. Now remember, this space-time distortion is taking place 360 degrees around the disk. So if you were looking at the disk from the top, the space-time distortion would be in the shape of a donut. When the gravitational field around the disk is so intense that the space-time distortion around the disk achieves maximum distortion and is folded up into this heart-shaped form, the disk can't be seen from any vantage point, and for all practical purposes is invisible. All you could see would be the sky surrounding it. The program out at Area S4 consisted of 3 projects: Project Galileo, Project Sidekick, and Project Looking Glass. Project Galileo dealt with gravity propulsion and was the source of all the information you've learned in this first section. Project Sidekick dealt with a beam weapon that had a neutron source and was focused by a gravity lens. Project Looking Glass dealt with the physics of seeing back in time. Now, I was not personally involved with the hardware of Project Sidekick or Looking Glass, and those projects are beyond the scope of this video. So this brings us to the end of this first part, in which I'm presenting to you as fact. At this point, we begin our second part, which is the section that contains what I call excerpts from the government Bible. I call it that because, as you can tell from part one, there's a small segment of the United States government that makes scientific and technological judgments from a knowledge base that is not available to the general public. If the following information is true, the United States government also makes judgments on a historical, philosophical, and even theological level from a knowledge base that is not available to the general public. These are excerpts from some of that information. As part of my indoctrination into the program at S4, I would randomly be taken into a small room which contained a table, a chair, and 120 or so briefings in blue folders. I'd be left there to read for varying amounts of time, usually about half an hour. These briefings contained a wide spectrum of information, mostly relating to aliens and alien technology. These reports appeared to be an overview of alien information which can be used to brief scientists from any field about the scope of the whole project, and not just their specific field of endeavor. The overview of Project Galileo was accurate. I read the overview and later witnessed evidence which proved it to be accurate. So it is possible that scientists involved with other projects could have seen evidence that these other overviews were also accurate, but I can't make that assertion. To me, these reports were simply words on paper. So to keep from saying allegedly and supposedly in every sentence, I'll relay this information to you as I read it, since I've already put this disclaimer on it. This technology that you've learned about thus far was brought here by some alien beings from the Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2 star system. These stars are located in the constellation of Reticulum, which can only be seen from the southern hemisphere. Zeta Reticuli is a binary star system, which means it has 2 stars, and is located approximately 30 light years from Earth. These beings are from Reticulum 4, which is the 4th planet out from Zeta Reticuli 2. This is the way star systems were referred to in these reports. They simply designate the name of the star and the number of planets from the nearest to the furthest from the star. For instance, our Sun was designated as Sol, and the Earth was referred to as Sol 3 because we're the 3rd planet out from the Sun. A day on Reticulum 4 is 90 Earth hours long. The beings are 3 to 4 feet tall and weigh 25 to 50 pounds. They have grayish skin and large heads with almond-shaped wraparound eyes. They have very slight nose, mouth, and ear positions and are hairless. Any dates in the information regarding these beings were written in a 6-digit number which began with 1623. Since I had no idea what the 6-digit number was for the present year, I had no way of calculating when these beings arrived, or at least arrived this time. These beings said that they had been visiting Earth for a long time and presented photographic evidence which they contended was over 10,000 years old. There was an exchange of hardware and information in central Nevada until 1979, at which time there was a conflict which brought the program to an abrupt halt. The beings left, but were to return at a 1623 date, and I don't know what that date is. With the remaining hardware and information, the U.S. government started the back engineering program. In May of 1987, some scientists took an antimatter reactor to an underground blast facility on the Nevada test site to perform an experiment. Unfortunately for them, their experiment required them to cut the reactor open, which resulted in their deaths. This explosion was explained to others at the test site as a previously unannounced low-yield underground nuke test. I was hired in December of 1988 to replace one of these men. These beings conveyed information about the capability of affecting the human brain to anesthetize the human body. This is done without any physical contact from a remote source. For this anesthesia to be accomplished, the brain has to be in a relaxed state similar to that required for hypnosis. If the brain is subject to any external stimulation like stimulant drugs or loud music, this manipulation of the nervous system is ineffective. These beings said that man was the product of externally corrected evolution. They said that man, as a species, had been genetically altered 65 times. They referred to humans as containers, yet I don't know what we're containers of. As I'm sure you now know, it was impossible for me to corroborate the information in the second section. And obviously, if this information is true, the ramifications are far-reaching, and you don't have to be a nuclear physicist to figure that out. So before I bring this to an end, there are a couple of questions I should address for you. The first one is, how did I get into this program? While working at Los Alamos National Lab in 1982, the local newspaper did a front-page story on a jet car I had built. Coincidentally, Dr. Teller was giving a speech in Los Alamos that same day. We met and had a short chat about the jet car, and I later listened to his speech. I never met Dr. Teller again, but in 1988, when I decided to re-enter the scientific community, I sent him a resume and inquired about a job. Dr. Teller responded by telephone and told me that he was no longer active, but just functioned in a consultant capacity. He gave me the name of a contact to call in Las Vegas. I made that call, and things progressed from there until I got into the program. I never got a chance to ask Dr. Teller if he remembered me from Los Alamos, so I don't know if that was a factor or not.
If you use nuclear fuel, and not that possible, nuclear fuel is feasible. But whether these events will last, which are interesting, if you ever want to get there, let's start. That is an important question. And that's about all I can say. All I have time to say. And what specifically the fuel will be, I think it might be fission, more probably fusion. And it was not so.
Is there any other nuclear reaction besides fission and fusion that you know of?
No.
Anything?
But look, please, you try to explore the things about which I only will have to tell you it is not interesting, it's a waste of time.
Above plutonium or
Look, it is, in my opinion, not interesting. I don't intend to answer it. If you ask me that question on camera, I will shut up. I will sit silent. You're not going to get an answer out of me on that.
Okay. And if I ask you on camera if you know Bob Lazar, can you just say no?
I will sit silently.
The second question is that if all I've just presented to you is true and the government is keeping this a secret, how can I make a video telling you about it? Well, the bottom line is, if there are any repercussions from making this video, it would simply confirm that what I told you is true. So what you do with this information is up to you. Remember, not everyone who sees a disk in the sky is crazy, so keep your eye on the sky, especially here in central Nevada, and thanks for listening.